In the summer of 2002, a grizzly bear named Bear 264 was fitted with a GPS collar in Yellowstone National Park as part of a long-term monitoring effort that researchers at the time believed would yield useful but ultimately modest data about seasonal movement and habitat use. What the data produced over the following years was something that no one had framed as a hypothesis before the study began. Bear 264 was avoiding some of the best food in the park. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. Not occasionally, not randomly, not due to competitive pressure from larger bears or territorial boundaries with other individuals. She was avoiding productive feeding areas with a precision and a consistency that could only be explained by one variable: people. Not the presence of people in the abstract sense of a landscape altered by human activity. The presence of people in the literal sense of human bodies at specific locations on specific days, and she was detecting that presence and adjusting her movements accordingly with a reliability that the GPS record made impossible to attribute to chance. She was doing this at significant caloric cost to herself. The meadows she avoided during daylight hours, the berry patches she did not use during peak human traffic periods, the riparian corridors she entered only after dark when foot traffic dropped to zero. These were not marginal resources. They were some of the best food the park had to offer during the critical pre-hibernation period, when every calorie a grizzly bear consumes translates directly into fat reserves and, ultimately, reproductive success. She was paying a biological price to avoid contact with humans that she could not afford to ignore, and she was not alone. If you have found this, and you are the kind of person who wants to understand what is actually happening in wild ecosystems beneath the surface of the official interpretation, subscribe now and do not miss what follows. What Bear 264 was doing in 2002 had been happening across the Yellowstone grizzly population for years before anyone had the data resolution to see it clearly. The GPS collar technology of the late 1990s and early 2000s was transforming wildlife research in ways that produced not just better information about where animals went, but a capacity to answer questions about why that had previously been beyond the technical reach of field biology. When you know where an animal is every hour of every day across multiple years, you can begin to cross-reference that movement record against data sets that describe the world the animal is moving through. Trail use records, campsite occupancy logs, visitor count data from park entry stations, road traffic volumes. The animal's movement record stops being a line on a map and becomes a response variable in a natural experiment running continuously across the entire landscape. The question the experiment is asking, without anyone designing it, is simple. What does this animal do when people show up? The answer that 17 years of GPS data from dozens of collared Yellowstone grizzlies produced is not simple. It is layered, it is context-dependent, it is seasonal, and it has implications for the management of grizzly bears that go far beyond anything the original monitoring program was designed to address. The Yellowstone grizzly population is one of the most studied large carnivore populations in the world. The bear that most people picture when they think about Yellowstone, large, blonde-tipped, moving through an open meadow with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has no predators, is an animal that has been watched, tracked, collared, and documented more intensively than almost any other wild creature on the planet. The monitoring program that began in earnest in the 1970s under the Craighead brothers, using the early radio telemetry methods that were just becoming available to wildlife researchers, has evolved through successive generations of tracking technology into a data collection enterprise that now generates continuous location records for dozens of individual bears simultaneously. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, which coordinates grizzly monitoring across the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, has been accumulating GPS location data since the late 1990s. And the dataset that has emerged from that accumulation is the analytical foundation on which the most important recent findings about grizzly behavior have been built. 17 years of GPS locations. Hundreds of thousands of individual location fixes. Dozens of individual bears tracked across multiple years of their lives. When researchers began asking the dataset what it revealed about the relationship between grizzly movement and human presence, the answer came back with a clarity that surprised even the scientists who spent their careers studying these animals. The clearest findings center on what biologists call temporal avoidance, which is the adjustment of activity timing to reduce overlap with a perceived threat. The basic phenomenon is well established in wildlife biology. Many animals adjust when they are active in response to predator pressure, shifting activity toward periods when the predator is less likely to be present. What makes the Yellowstone grizzly data unusual is the precision and the scale of the temporal avoidance response and the identity of the perceived threat that is triggering it. Grizzlies are not shifting their activity to avoid wolves or other bears, though competition with both shapes their behavior in important ways. They are shifting their activity to avoid hikers. They are shifting it to avoid road traffic. They are shifting it to avoid the presence of human beings in areas that the bears, based on every other ecological indicator, would strongly prefer to use during the hours when those human beings are present. The shift is not small. At the most productive feeding sites, in the most heavily visited parts of the park, the GPS data shows grizzlies arriving at the edges of these areas in daylight, holding in adjacent cover, and then moving into the resource after human activity has declined in the early evening. The caloric cost of that delay, particularly during the hyperphagia period in late summer and early fall, when bears are consuming tens of thousands of calories per day in preparation for hibernation, is measurable and significant. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what hyperphagia means for a grizzly bear. Hyperphagia is the period of intense feeding that precedes hibernation in bears across the northern hemisphere. And it is not an exaggeration to say that everything else in a grizzly bear's annual life history flows from how well or how poorly that period goes. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, hyperphagia typically runs from late July through October. During this period, a large adult male grizzly needs to consume approximately 20,000 calories per day to add the fat reserves necessary to survive a winter den period that may last 5 to 6 months without food or water. Female grizzlies with cubs have caloric requirements during hyperphagia that are, on a per-animal basis, even more demanding, because they are fueling not just their own fat deposition, but the growth of cubs that will be born during the den period, and will depend entirely on the mother's milk, produced from those fat reserves, for their first months of life. A female grizzly that enters the den in poor body condition, with inadequate fat reserves because her access to high-quality food during hyperphagia was compromised, will produce fewer cubs, produce less milk, lose more cubs to in-den mortality, and emerge in spring in a compromised nutritional state that cascades into reduced reproductive performance in subsequent years. The fat a grizzly puts on in fall is not just energy for winter. It is the biological currency that determines how many living cubs get up from a den in April. This is why the behavioral findings from the GPS data are not merely interesting as a scientific matter. They are directly connected to the reproductive performance and population trajectory of one of the most ecologically and culturally significant wildlife populations in North America. If grizzly bears in Yellowstone are systematically excluded from their best food sources during the most nutritionally critical period of the year because those food sources are occupied by human visitors during the daylight hours when bears would otherwise prefer to use them, the management and conservation implications are substantial. The question of how substantial, and what, if anything, should be done about it, is the question that the data is now forcing wildlife managers to confront in ways that the pre-GPS era of grizzly research could not. The feeding areas at the center of this story are not evenly distributed across the park. Yellowstone covers 2.2 million acres, but the landscape is not nutritionally uniform from a grizzly bear's perspective. The most productive food resources for grizzlies are concentrated in specific habitat types and specific elevational zones that shift seasonally as different food sources come into production. In late spring and early summer, grizzlies concentrate on the low-elevation meadows and riparian corridors, where winter-killed ungulates provide carrion, where emerging forbs like clover and yampa provide digestible protein and carbohydrates, and where spawning cutthroat trout, historically one of the most important food sources in the Yellowstone ecosystem, concentrate in shallow tributary streams. As summer progresses, bears shift upslope, following the progression of plant growth that tracks snowmelt, accessing whitebark pine seed caches, army cutworm moth aggregations on high talus slopes, and the late summer berry patches of huckleberry, buffaloberry, and serviceberry that provide the high-sugar, high-calorie fuel that drives fat deposition. The elevational gradient of this feeding pattern means that bears at different seasons of the year are using different parts of the park, and those different parts of the park have different levels of human use, different visitor infrastructure, and different degrees of access restriction. The areas with the highest human visitation density in Yellowstone are predictable. The road corridors, the geyser basins, the major valleys, and the developed facilities attract the overwhelming majority of the park's 4 million annual visitors into a small fraction of the park's total area. The backcountry, the high-elevation terrain, the roadless zones that make up the majority of the park's acreage sees a tiny fraction of that visitation. But the bears do not distribute themselves purely in relation to visitor numbers. They distribute themselves in relation to food. And food, in certain critical seasons, is concentrated in the same zones and habitat types that also concentrate human visitors. The spring ungulate carrion that sustains grizzlies emerging from dens in April is found in the valley bottoms where the roads are. The cutthroat trout spawning runs that historically provided critical protein during the lean post-emergence period occur in tributary streams that are accessible from road corridors and heavily visited by anglers and wildlife watchers. The meadow complexes that produce the forb communities grizzlies depend on in early summer are often in areas that also produce the iconic wildlife viewing opportunities that draw visitors to specific locations repeatedly and predictably. The spatial overlap between the best grizzly food in certain seasons and the highest human presence is not coincidental. It is a function of the same landscape features, the valleys, the waterways, the open terrain, that make an area productive for both wildlife and for the human experience of observing wildlife. The GPS data resolves this overlap with an uncomfortable clarity. Bears, with collar data from the heavily visited road corridors and valley bottoms, show consistent patterns of nighttime use and daytime avoidance in precisely the areas and seasons where human presence peaks. The temporal pattern is not subtle. In some cases, the data shows bears that spent daylight hours within a few hundred meters of a feeding area that they entered within minutes of human traffic declining in the evening. The margin between where the bear chose to wait and where it chose to go was not a landscape feature, not a competitor's territory, not a prey distribution boundary. It was a human boundary. The bear was reading the human presence in that area with a precision and a responsiveness that the GPS record makes visible as a behavioral signature repeated across days, weeks, and seasonal cycles with remarkable consistency. What makes this more than a story about bears avoiding hikers is the context in which it is happening. The Yellowstone grizzly population has recovered dramatically from the low of approximately 150 individuals that prompted the species listing under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. Current estimates place the population at around 700 animals in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, a recovery that represents one of the genuine successes of the Endangered Species Act and of the intensive management and monitoring effort that has accompanied the population's growth. The delisting debate, which has proceeded through multiple rounds of federal rulemaking and legal challenge, centers partly on whether the population is stable and productive enough to sustain regulated hunting outside park boundaries, and partly on whether the threats that originally drove the population to its listed status have been adequately addressed. The food security question is central to both of those debates, and the GPS data on human avoidance behavior introduces a dimension of food security analysis that the recovery narrative has not fully incorporated. If grizzly bears in the core of the recovery zone are being displaced from productive feeding areas by human presence during the most nutritionally critical season of their year, the calculation of population-level nutritional adequacy that informs delisting decisions is missing a variable. The monitoring framework that tracks grizzly population performance, using indicators like female survival rates, litter sizes, and cub survival, captures the demographic outcome of nutritional adequacy or inadequacy. It does not capture, at least not directly, the behavioral mechanism by which human presence during hyperphagia reduces access to food resources in a way that degrades the nutritional inputs that drive those demographic outcomes. The GPS data connects those two levels of analysis in a way that creates both scientific and management obligations. It is not just showing that bears avoid people, it is showing that bears avoid people at a caloric cost, and that caloric cost is paying out in ways that population monitoring is measuring without fully understanding the source. The whitebark pine story adds another layer to this picture that is essential to understanding what grizzlies are dealing with in Yellowstone on a structural level. Whitebark pine seeds have historically been the single most important high-calorie food source for Yellowstone grizzlies during the late hyperphagia period. A whitebark pine seed contains roughly 50% fat by dry weight. A grizzly bear excavating red squirrel seed caches at a productive whitebark pine stand in September can consume thousands of calories per hour in a feeding mode that requires relatively little of the locomotor energy that foraging over large areas of lower quality habitat demands. The whitebark pine of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem has been devastated over the past 2 decades by a combination of white pine blister rust, mountain pine beetle outbreak, and climate-driven changes in snowpack and temperature that have extended beetle survival at high elevations where cold historically limited population growth. The tree is dying across its range at a rate that represents one of the most significant ecological changes in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in the modern era. Stands that provided reliable, high-density seed crops annually within living memory now produce a fraction of their historical seed yield. The GPS data from bears in high-elevation whitebark pine zones during September and October shows the behavioral consequence of that collapse. Bears that their collar histories show spending multiple weeks in seed-rich whitebark pine stands in earlier years are now moving through the same areas in hours, not finding enough food to justify extended residence, and descending to lower elevations earlier in the season to search for alternative calorie sources. Those alternative calorie sources are not evenly distributed, and some of the best alternatives are in the human-heavy valleys and road corridors that the avoidance behavior documented in the GPS data shows bears treating as conditionally accessible resources. Accessible when people are not present, avoided when they are. The structural food insecurity produced by the whitebark pine collapse is pushing bears toward lower elevation feeding areas at exactly the times of year when those areas are most heavily used by human visitors. The two trends, the nutritional gap created by whitebark pine loss and the human displacement effect, documented in the GPS data, are compounding each other in a way that the management framework has been slow to integrate. The cutthroat trout dimension of this story is the one that most directly illustrates how a change introduced by human activity can cascade through a grizzly's entire foraging ecology in ways that are almost impossible to see without long-term, high-resolution behavioral data. Yellowstone Lake's native cutthroat trout population was, for the first several thousand years of post-glacial settlement in the Yellowstone Basin, the largest inland cutthroat trout population in North America. The lake's spawning tributaries, including the Pelican Creek drainage, Chipmunk Creek, and dozens of smaller streams draining the Absaroka Range into the lake's eastern shore, hosted annual spawning runs that represented an extraordinary concentration of high-quality protein that grizzlies had been exploiting for millennia. The GPS data from collared bears working these streams in the late 1990s shows the behavioral signature of that exploitation. Bears concentrated at tributary mouths and in shallow spawning reaches, feeding with an efficiency and a duration that the caloric density of spawning trout makes possible. Individual bears gained substantial weight during the spring trout period. The demographic data from those years shows the caloric benefit of reliable trout access, translating into female body condition and reproductive output. The lake trout were introduced into Yellowstone Lake illegally, likely in the late 1980s, and their presence was confirmed by researchers in 1994. What followed was one of the most consequential ecological invasions in the history of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Lake trout are deep-water predators that eat cutthroat trout. They are also not accessible to grizzly bears, which cannot feed in the deep water where lake trout live and hunt. As lake trout populations in Yellowstone Lake grew through the 1990s and 2000s, preying on cutthroat trout that spawn in the lake's tributary streams, the cutthroat trout spawning runs that grizzlies depended on collapsed. The GPS data from bears working the spawning tributaries tells this story with devastating precision. Bears that in earlier collar histories spent weeks in the Pelican drainage during June and July began showing shorter residence times at the same locations. Then seasonal use that dropped to occasional investigation passes rather than sustained feeding bouts. Then, in some cases, complete abandonment of stream reaches that had been reliable hyperphagia contributors for the duration of the monitoring record. The trout were gone, and the bears had to find the calories somewhere else. The somewhere else, documented in the GPS records, is the lower elevation road corridors and valley meadows where human presence is heaviest. The spatial shift in grizzly foraging effort that followed the cutthroat trout collapse is visible in the aggregate movement data as a progressive loading of bear activity into terrain that bears had historically used less intensively. Bears that would have spent spring weeks in the upper Pelican drainage moved instead into the Hayden Valley and the Lamar Valley, both heavily visited, both managed with visitor access that concentrates thousands of people in the areas of highest wildlife visibility, both producing the human presence signature in the GPS data that the avoidance analysis reveals. The cutthroat trout collapse did not just remove a food source. It redistributed grizzly foraging effort into terrain where the human displacement effect now costs bears caloric access that they lost the high-elevation alternative to years ago. The behavioral mechanics of how a grizzly bear detects and processes human presence as a displacement cue is worth examining in detail, because the intuitive explanation that bears smell people and leave substantially understates the sophistication of what the GPS data is showing. Grizzly bears have olfactory capabilities that are, by various measures, among the most acute of any land mammal on Earth. The portion of a grizzly's brain devoted to processing olfactory information is proportionally enormous. Their ability to detect and discriminate scents at distances and concentrations that are far beyond human sensory experience means that a bear approaching a meadow complex in late afternoon has detailed olfactory information about human activity in that area that may extend to hours of history. It can detect the difference between an area where people were present this morning and are no longer there, and an area where people are currently present. It can detect individual scents associated with specific types of human activity. It can, the research suggests, learn to associate specific scent profiles with specific risk levels based on its experience with human encounters. A bear that has had a negative encounter with people at a specific location carries that associative memory into subsequent visits to the same area. A bear that has learned that people at a specific trail access point are reliable and consistent in their temporal patterns, arriving in the morning and leaving before dark, has the behavioral information it needs to time its use of adjacent resources around that pattern. The GPS data reveals that the most experienced adult bears in the monitored population are the most sophisticated in their temporal avoidance behavior. Young bears, particularly subadults using the park for the first time, show less precise avoidance patterns. They make more errors, entering human-occupied areas and then retreating, approaching road corridors at inappropriate times and being moved by ranger management action, using feeding areas during human peak hours in ways that produce the conflict encounters that drive management interventions. Adult females with multiple years of GPS history show progressively more precise temporal separation from human activity across their collar records. The avoidance behavior improves with experience. The bears are learning. They are building a model of human temporal patterns in specific locations and adjusting their movement schedules to optimize their own resource access around the constraints that model imposes. This is not instinctive avoidance of a feared stimulus. It is adaptive behavioral optimization in response to a learned landscape of risk and opportunity. The spatial scale of this displacement is one of the most striking features of the dataset. The conventional assumption about wildlife displacement by human presence is that it operates at relatively small spatial scales, that an animal disturbed at a feeding site moves a short distance to an adjacent area and resumes feeding once the disturbance passes. The GPS data from Yellowstone grizzlies challenges this assumption at both ends of the scale spectrum. At the fine scale, the temporal avoidance behavior shows that bears are not being displaced from their feeding areas in the sense of moving to different locations. They are holding near their preferred locations, waiting for the human presence to clear, and then returning to the same sites. The displacement is temporal, not spatial. The bear has not gone elsewhere. It has waited, and the waiting has a cost measured in hours of potential feeding time not realized during the best foraging window of the day. At the landscape scale, the data shows something different and more consequential. The cumulative effect of daily temporal avoidance across a full hyperphagia season, repeated across multiple seasons in areas where human visitor pressure is highest, appears to be producing a progressive shifting of habitat use at the seasonal scale. Bears that spend days or weeks timing their movements around human schedules in heavily visited zones are showing, in the aggregate multi-year GPS records, a gradual drift in their home range cores toward terrain that has lower human presence, even when that terrain is nutritionally inferior. The avoidance behavior that optimizes daily caloric access, given the constraint of human presence, is, at the seasonal scale, slowly pushing bears away from the best food and into second-rate terrain. The displacement is not happening in a single dramatic event. It is accumulating across thousands of small daily adjustments into a landscape-scale shift in habitat use that has nutritional consequences visible in the population monitoring data and demographic consequences that flow from there. The research team that published the most comprehensive analysis of this pattern, drawing on collar data from more than 40 individual grizzlies, tracked across periods ranging from 3 to 12 years each, framed their findings in terms of what they called the human shield effect and its inverse. The human shield effect is a phenomenon documented in other predator-prey systems, in which prey animals deliberately position themselves near human activity to reduce their exposure to predators. Wolves, in Yellowstone, in some contexts, avoid areas of high human presence. Elk in those same areas sometimes show higher use of the human-occupied zones, using the wolves' avoidance of people as a partial refuge from predation pressure. The grizzly data reveals the inverse of this effect operating in the food resource domain. The areas with the highest human presence contain some of the best food, but impose a temporal access cost that the bears are paying in daily caloric terms and population-level nutritional terms in ways that the management framework has not fully absorbed. The management implications of this research are being discussed in the wildlife management community, with a seriousness that reflects the quality of the underlying data and the credibility of the researchers who produced it. The discussion is happening in a landscape of institutional complexity that makes translating the science into management action substantially harder than the science itself. Yellowstone National Park operates under a mandate codified in the Organic Act of 1916 and elaborated in subsequent legislation and policy to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources of the park while providing for the enjoyment of the same by the public. The tension between those two objectives, preserving resources and providing public enjoyment, is the oldest and most persistent management challenge in the national park system. The grizzly displacement data puts that tension in sharp relief with a specificity that is unusual. It is not just showing that bears and people share the same landscape, it is showing that bears and people compete for access to specific resources at specific times, and that the competition is currently resolved in favor of people in ways that impose measurable ecological costs on the bears. The suite of management responses under consideration within the Park Service ranges from informational to structural to regulatory. At the informational end, the argument is that making the findings of the GPS research more visible to the visiting public might produce voluntary behavioral changes. Visitors who understand that the meadow they are entering during an evening wildlife viewing session is precisely the feeding area that a collared grizzly has been waiting at the edge of for 6 hours might make different decisions about how long they stay, how much noise they make, or whether to disperse more widely rather than concentrating at the high wildlife visibility sites that current visitor guidance directs them toward. The informational approach assumes a level of visitor knowledge and behavioral flexibility that the park's visitor experience management data does not strongly support, but it is the approach that imposes the fewest constraints on visitor access, and is therefore the one most compatible with the dual mandate. At the structural end, the argument involves reconfiguring the spatial and temporal distribution of visitor access in a way that reduces overlap with critical grizzly feeding areas during hyperphagia season. This might mean closing specific trail segments during August and September, adjusting the timing of ranger-led wildlife viewing programs to concentrate visitor presence in specific areas during mornings rather than evenings, or redesigning visitor stopping areas along road corridors in the major wildlife viewing valleys to reduce the duration of human presence at specific high-value feeding locations. Each of these structural options imposes costs on the visitor experience that have political and institutional implications the Park Service must weigh against the ecological benefits. The National Park Service is not operationally free to simply optimize for bare caloric access. It is managing a public resource for a public constituency that has legitimate claims on the park experience, and those claims do not automatically yield to the GPS coordinates of a bear's preferred evening feeding location. At the regulatory end, the most aggressive proposals involve seasonal access restrictions in the areas of highest human grizzly feeding overlap that go beyond the current management framework. Areas that are now open to dispersed hiking use during the critical fall hyperphagia window could be placed on the same seasonal restriction schedule as the most sensitive grizzly management areas in the park, where trail access is already limited to groups of 4 or more, and where camping is prohibited during certain seasons. The regulatory approach would produce the most direct ecological benefit in terms of reducing temporal displacement and restoring grizzly access to key food resources during hyperphagia. But it would also produce the most significant political response from visitor advocacy groups, gateway community businesses that depend on fall visitation, and the congressional delegations of states in the Yellowstone region that have historically resisted management actions they characterize as reducing public access to public lands. The conversation about how to resolve this tension is happening inside the Park Service and in the research community, and it is a conversation that the GPS data has fundamentally changed. Before 17 years of high-resolution location data showed, with statistical rigor, that bears are foregoing caloric access in specific amounts at specific locations because of human presence. The management discussion was largely hypothetical. Wildlife managers knew that people and bears shared space in ways that were sometimes consequential for both, but the nature and magnitude of those interactions was difficult to quantify in terms that translated directly into population-level effects. The GPS data has changed that. It has provided the quantitative foundation for a management argument that can specify not just that displacement is happening, but how much, where, when, and at what caloric cost per bear per season. That specificity is both the most powerful feature of the research from a scientific standpoint and the most challenging feature from a management standpoint, because it converts a general ecological concern into a specific policy problem with defined trade-offs and identifiable constituencies on both sides. The individual bears in the GPS dataset have become something more than data points in this conversation, and the way their stories have been used by researchers to illustrate the aggregate findings is worth noting because it reveals something important about how the science is being communicated and to whom. The researchers who work most closely with the Yellowstone grizzly collar data are careful about anthropomorphizing individual animals in ways that might distort the scientific message, but they are also human beings who have spent years watching specific animals move through a landscape they know intimately, and the behavioral records of specific individuals illuminate the aggregate patterns in ways that the aggregate statistics alone do not. Bear 399, the most famous grizzly in Yellowstone and arguably the most photographed bear in the world during the last 2 decades, has a GPS history that her researchers describe as a case study in the management tension between visitor access and bear resource access. Her regular movements through the Jackson Lake and Willow Flats areas of Grand Teton National Park, which borders Yellowstone to the south, have made her the subject of more wildlife photography and wildlife viewing activity than any other grizzly in the population. She has also, according to researchers familiar with her collar history, been repeatedly displaced from feeding areas by precisely the concentrations of human observers that her presence attracts. The irony is complete and somewhat painful. The most watched bear in Yellowstone's neighborhood is paying caloric costs partly attributable to the process of being watched. The broader pattern of what researchers call the tourism trap is visible in the aggregate data and is one of the more counterintuitive findings to emerge from the GPS research. The areas of highest human visitation in Yellowstone and Grand Teton are also, in many seasons, the areas of highest wildlife visibility, precisely because those areas are nutritionally productive and therefore attract the wildlife that visitors come to see. The road corridors through the Hayden Valley, the Lamar Valley, and the lower Snake River Flats in Grand Teton are not random visitor attractors. They are locations where the probability of seeing large mammals is genuinely higher than it would be in most of the surrounding backcountry. The wildlife brings the people, and the people, the GPS data suggests, bring the temporal displacement that reduces the wildlife's caloric access to the resources that make the area attractive in the first place. The feedback loop is not vicious in the sense of being rapidly self-destroying. The ecosystem is robust enough and the bears are adaptable enough that the dynamic is playing out on a timescale of years and decades rather than seasons. But the direction of the feedback is not neutral, and the trajectory it implies, more visitors, more displacement pressure, less efficient hyperphagia in the most productive habitats, incremental negative effects on body condition and reproductive performance, is one that the recovery narrative for the Yellowstone grizzly has not yet incorporated into its accounting. The question of whether the bear's avoidance of humans is a fixed behavioral response or a plastic one that could be modified by changes in the human presence pattern is one that the GPS data is beginning to address. The evidence for behavioral plasticity in the avoidance response comes from collar records in areas where management-driven changes in human access patterns have occurred. In a small number of cases where trail closures or visitor management interventions produced measurable reductions in human presence at specific locations during specific seasons, subsequent GPS records from bears using those areas show patterns consistent with adjusted temporal use, specifically less nocturnal restriction and more daytime feeding activity. The effect is not dramatic and the sample sizes are small, but the direction is consistent with a prediction that the avoidance behavior is responding to actual human presence rather than to a fixed learned association that is resistant to change once established. This is cautiously encouraging from a management perspective because it suggests that interventions designed to reduce human presence at key feeding locations during critical seasons would produce behavioral responses in the bears that correspond to reduced caloric displacement. The bears appear to be capable of updating their assessment of which areas are safe to use during daylight hours when the human presence signal changes. The management challenge is producing that change in the human presence signal in ways that are politically and institutionally achievable. The comparison with other grizzly populations in North America, where the human-wildlife interface takes different forms, is instructive in ways that the Yellowstone-centric management discussion sometimes misses. In Glacier National Park, where the grizzly population operates in a different landscape configuration, with different visitor patterns and different spatial relationships between human access infrastructure and key feeding areas, the GPS data from collared individuals shows a somewhat different displacement signature. The high country terrain of Glacier, where visitors are concentrated in specific corridor routes in summer, produces temporal and spatial displacement patterns that reflect the park's particular trail and road network, rather than a universal human avoidance response. In the greater Yellowstone ecosystem's peripheral zones outside the national parks, where grizzlies interact with a different human presence, including livestock operators, hunters, and motorized recreationists. The displacement patterns documented in collar data reflect those human activity types rather than the foot traffic and wildlife viewing concentrations that dominate the park's human landscape. The comparison across sites suggests that bears are responding to specific human activity signatures in specific landscape contexts, rather than to a generalized human presence that produces the same response everywhere. This spatial and behavioral specificity matters for management because it implies that targeted interventions in specific locations and activity types might produce larger benefits per unit of management effort than broad, uniform restrictions that treat all human presence as equivalent in its displacement effect. The legal and regulatory framework within which the Yellowstone grizzly lives has been undergoing its own complex evolution during the same period that the GPS research has been developing. The Endangered Species Act listing that drove the recovery program, the 1975 listing as a threatened species in the lower 48 states, has been the subject of repeated delisting proposals as the population has grown, and repeated legal challenges that have kept the bear under federal protection through multiple cycles of agency action and court review. The delisting debate involves a set of scientific and legal arguments about population size, connectivity, food security, and the adequacy of state management plans that is technically complex and institutionally charged. The GPS findings about human-driven caloric displacement during hyperphagia introduce into that debate a data set that neither side of the delisting argument has fully integrated into its position. For those opposed to delisting, the data provides evidence that the recovery narrative overstates the nutritional security of the population by failing to account for the food access costs imposed by visitor pressure during the most critical feeding season. For those supporting delisting, the data provides evidence that the population is behaviorally capable of adapting to human presence, which might be read as evidence of resilience rather than vulnerability. The data is sufficiently nuanced to be interpreted through multiple analytical frames, and its ultimate influence on the delisting debate will depend partly on how the scientific community chooses to present it, and partly on how the legal and political process is shaped by other considerations that have nothing to do with the GPS records of individual bears. What 17 years of GPS data has produced, in the end, is not a crisis narrative and not a reassurance narrative. It has produced something harder to use than either of those, which is a detailed, quantitative, behaviorally grounded account of a conflict that is neither catastrophic nor trivial. Grizzly bears in Yellowstone are not being driven to extinction by human visitor pressure. The population is growing. The animals are surviving. The recovery is real. But something is also being paid for that growth and that recovery, in a currency that the population accounting ledger does not directly capture. The bears are using their intelligence and their behavioral flexibility to navigate a landscape that has been made more complex and more costly by the pattern of human presence in the areas of greatest food productivity. They are adapting. They are succeeding in the sense of surviving and reproducing. But the adaptation has costs, and those costs are being extracted during the hours of daylight that a grizzly bear spends at the edge of a meadow it should be in the dark, waiting for the last human car to leave the pullout, waiting for the group of hikers to finish their loop trail, waiting for the space that was once simply available, in the caloric time that cannot be recovered once the season has turned and the cold has come and the long fasting of winter has begun. The GPS collar hanging around the neck of a Yellowstone grizzly does not know what it is recording. It fires a location fix every hour and transmits it to a satellite, and a team of researchers downloads the data and begins the analysis that connects where the bear was to what was happening in that part of the park at that time of day. The bear does not know that it is being documented. It knows where it is. It knows where the food is. It knows where the people are. And it makes the calculation that its experience and its intelligence have taught it to make every hour of every day, across the seasons of its life. The calculation is sophisticated, and the animal making it is remarkable. The question that 17 years of watching that calculation in granular, hourly detail has produced is not whether the bear can handle the pressure. The question is whether we can afford to keep watching it adapt to something that we are choosing to impose on it, and whether choosing to keep imposing it represents the relationship with these animals and this ecosystem that the recovery project was supposed to build. The data has made that question precise and specific, and empirically grounded in a way that the general conversation about wildlife and tourism and protected areas never quite was before. The bears have been telling us something for 17 years in the language of their movement through a shared landscape. The GPS collars have been translating. The translation is complete. Whether we read it honestly and act on what it says is the decision that now belongs entirely to us.